just said he's doing that
All right,
a lot.
cool.
So
Excellent. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Tina Incorvia, who's no stranger to Harvard. So she actually got a PhD here in 2015 from Harvard, I guess. Well, I just learned what's better. A formal advisor, but she did most of the work at MIT in Lateral. And then she did most of it at Stanford in the electrical engineering department and joined UT Austin, WE, right, in 2017. And she's leading the group that works in electronics. And so here's some for today. Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, so very low. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, it's green now. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you today about my work on...
It's a bit loud, I think.
Is it a bit loud? How about now? That's better. On using these magnetic nano devices to do computation closer to how the brain computes. So I'll start out with the motivation for why we are interested in new paradigms of computing and why magnetic materials is one promising direction for addressing some of our problems with current computing. I will then describe my work on magnetic synapses that show this biological behavior called spike time-independent plasticity. And I will then describe how very similar devices can also act as neurons with these behaviors of leaking, integration, firing, and lateral inhibition. And I'll go into why these properties are important for learning tasks. I'll then go into an example of what we can do with these types of devices that can more inherently capture these biological behaviors for learning. And I'll give the example of doing energy efficient semi-supervised learning where we can vastly reduce the necessary peripheral circuitry by using these devices compared to using CMOS. So there are many ways to approach considering the current problems with computing, but in particular, there are some obvious problems when we're performing data-intensive tasks. So one issue is that we have a large memory wall between our computing and our memory access. So for example, for genome sequencing, the computing time is 96% taken up by memory access. So the separation of memory and computation is drastically hurting our computing for big data tasks. We also have energy loss when the computer is idle. For example, if you use SRAM, the idle leakage can account for 20% of the total power consumed. So we're losing a lot of energy when the device is just sitting there. And lastly, another area where we lose a lot of power is in analog to digital conversion. And this is important both for data-intensive tasks and also for when we employ devices into the environment, where when we take some analog data and then we want to convert it to digital to send to the cloud, that can consume as much as 70% of the power that we need to use. So if we can do more of the computing at the node and send less information to the cloud, that could also be a great benefit. So one exciting direction for facing some of these challenges is the field of neuromorphic computing. And this really arises from when we look at the human brain, it can do certain tasks, especially these data-intensive tasks such as face recognition, with around 1 million times less power than supercomputers. So the question is, why can it do that? Some reasons that we've come up with is the memory is distributed with the processing, so we don't have this memory wall issue. The memory and logic system is very densely connected together, so there's a lot of connectivity going on in the brain. And the computing is done in a parallel manner where we're constantly being able to process inputs. And so these are some directions we want to go in when we think about how can we build artificial computers that better emulate the behavior of the brain. So the main building blocks of a neuromorphic computer are, like in the brain, we have neurons and synapses. So neurons are these cells that will activate and then fire a signal. And then that signal will go through a synapse to a receiving neuron cell. So this is our sending or presynaptic cell and our receiving postsynaptic cell. And the synapse really defines the connectivity of those neurons. So we define the synapse by its weight. So if the neurons are very well connected, then the synapse will be strong, but if they're weakly connected, then it'll be weak. So in order to achieve artificial neuromorphic computing, we need neurons and synapses that have the same functionalities as the brain. So we both need to understand what those functionalities are and how we can emulate them in our artificial devices. And we need to connect them together, how they're connected like in the brain. So how we want to do this? And there's many reasons why magnetic materials might be a good class of materials for implementing neuromorphic computing. The energy and write time to switch a nanomagnet with current or voltage it's very low voltage. It can go down to millivolts switching voltages, and also the time compared to other memory devices is relatively fast. It's like nanosecond switching regimes. So not as fast as CMOS, but faster than some other alternative memories. It's non-volatile, so that means when the magnet is sitting there, you're not doing anything to it, it has a magnetic moment, it keeps its state when it's off. So this can address these leakage problems. We can easily fabricate these magnetic devices with CMOS. That's called back-of-the-line compatibility. And so we can integrate them with existing technologies. For environmental applications, they have radiation hardness. And in particular, what I'm focusing on this talk is that there's complex features in the nanomagnetic physics that can be mapped onto these neuromorphic systems. So what we're looking at is magnetic domain wall dynamics, oscillatory behaviors, and magnetic stray field interactions. And all this physics, this rich physics, can be applied to these devices. So the device I'm focusing on this talk is called a 3-terminal magnetic tunnel junction. So this is a cartoon of what it looks like here. So we have a free layer, it's called a free ferromagnetic layer here, that has a magnetic moment in it. And then we have an output magnetic tunnel junction at the top here that can read out the state of the device. So when we pass the current between the in and the clock terminals, we can switch the magnetization in this bottom layer, or we can drive a magnetic domain wall, which is a transition region between magnetic domains, back and forth across this bottom layer. And this tunnel junction is a resistive memory element, where when these magnetic moments are in a parallel configuration, the output resistance is low or the current is high. And when they're anti-parallel, then we get a high resistance. So our memory element is in the center. And so this is an example SEM image of these devices that we fabricate. So you can see the center tunnel junction here, and this is the Kobar and Bourne wire. So one challenge with making these devices that we've faced and other groups have faced is that, so one thing is that this on-off ratio between when these are magnetized parallel versus anti-parallel is called the tunnel magnetoresistance, or TMR. So this on-off ratio isn't that high to begin with, and it degrades very easily when we try to pattern them into this 3-terminal structure. So this is some of my original data actually when I was working on my PhD, where if you look at the resistance of these two resistance states, we can go between around 55 to 60 ohms. This is around like a 15% on-off ratio. And this is another group out of Intel that had similar ratios after patterning this kind of structure with these tunnel junctions on top. They got around 10 to 15% on-off ratio. So one thing that we focused on in our group in the last year is really improving this. The switching is around nanosecond, 1 to 5 nanoseconds.
What limits that transfer to the?
It's really limited by if you're switching a magnetic moment, how fast it takes to do the processional switch. So it's really hard to get faster than a nanosecond unless you go to a different regime. So some people are working on ultra-fast switching using different mechanisms of the magnets. They can get it to picoseconds. Yeah. So in this collaboration with Applied Materials, firstly, we got as best films as we could by working with industry before patterning. And we see that even after patterning, this is after patterning into our 3-terminal structure, this is the resistance versus applied field, and we get a really big resistance change between 10 to 40 ohms. So over 200%, which is the highest that you expect to get with this type of magnetic material. And we also can switch a domain wall in this layer. So we can measure the resistance to this tunnel junction versus applied current. And we see that we get a switch at around 4 times 10 to the 10 amps per meter squared. So this is actually using a new effect called spin-orbit torque switching of the magnetization, which is much more energy efficient than previous effects. So we can get the high on-off ratio, and we can get low current density switching. So the devices are really ripe to be able to do a lot of what I'm showing in experiments. Yes?
You're correct, you have
one state at the top, and you're driving your domain wall, but it's the opposite way at the bottom, it's supposed to vertical.
Yeah.
Can you do that back and forth, or do you affect this upper spin by driving this?
You can do it back and forth, and actually, depending what we're trying to do, we sometimes purposely want to affect what's up above, and sometimes we don't. So how you do that, usually engineer it through the stack. Yeah, you can close the field loops and then prevent the stray field from interacting as much. It's a good question, yes. But I'm not showing you, but some of our work, we actually want to switch the top with the bottom. And you can do that too. Yeah.
How hysteretic is it?
How hysteretic is it?
Yeah,
So that's a good question. If you can notice, we include these little notches here on either side. That's to help reduce the hysteresis. Yeah, these are actually lithographic notches here. That helps catch the domain wall on either side at the same position every time, so it can be more repeatable and going back and forth.
So the domain wall isn't moving past the notch?
Yeah, it's moving past the junction, but sitting at each notch. Yeah. So this is as far as I'm going to talk to you about the devices and this talk, and the rest is going to be on theory and modeling to show what we can do with these devices. So I want to show you that we are also working on the experimental side. So let's first talk about how we can have these devices act as synapses. And please interrupt me with more questions. I like to have questions, yeah. So here's how we can take this 3-terminal magnetic tunnel junction and fabricate into both a synapse or a neuron structure. So I'm showing both here because I'm going to talk about the neuron in a second. But here, let's focus on the synapse. So again, a synapse is defined by something that can have multiple weights, where the weights can be controlled by the information coming from the neurons. And so we can achieve this by having a long magnetic tunnel junction in the center. So here now in the bottom layer, I show this domain wall transition between the up and down domains. And so if we can stop this domain wall at different distances past this, then we'll get a variation in this output resistance through the output center memory element. And that can be weights. So this resistance will encode our weights for our synapse. And just to show you where we're going with this, if we can create the synapses and the neurons both out of magnetic materials, then we can arrange them into a crossbar array, which is one layer of our neural network. And so we will have our input neurons, and they're going to come, and each of these nodes is one of our magnetic synapses, and then they can go out to some output neurons that can then feed into another layer of the circuit. So this is what the circuit looks like. Yeah?
Sorry, this is very more device stuff, but those curves, how do you just one of those device to device? Like these weights and sort of how far you are along and how that tunes the weight. It seems like you have to tune that for every single synapse. Is that a problem?
It's actually one reason that neuromorphic computing can handle a lot more errors than traditional computing can, because you have this huge network of synapses, and you're getting some average result from your circuit. So you don't care as much about, it can handle errors a lot better than traditional computing can.
I mean, like, let's say I want to do a neural net, and I want to program a specific number of weights. Like on this synapse, I want this weight. How correctly can you do that if these curves are not the same junction to junction?
What curve's not the same?
So if you go back a couple slides, so you're defining the weight by this RMTJ curve. Right?
Yeah.
That's what defines the weight.
Yeah.
You tune along its axis.
Yeah.
I'm saying reproducible device to device. Like, are you going to get the same weight at the same field?
Yeah. So you're talking about the device-to-device variability on a wafer.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of papers on that. There's usually a distribution of TMR and resistance, but it's tight enough that what that would do is limit your weights that you want to define. It would be, so you'd want to define enough weights that you can differentiate between the noise from device-to-device variability.
It's small enough that it's okay.
It's workable. Yeah, it's not easy though to do that. Yeah, you can say like Applied Materials, so who does a lot of this work, they try really hard and they still get it like a distribution. Yeah. I can send you that paper. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Okay, so the synapse behavior. So what this can look like theoretically is that if we have this resistance of the tunnel junction, and these are the different positions of this domain wall along the center tunnel junction, then our weights can be encoded by these different resistance states. And like I'm saying, well, you'd have to separate these enough that you can distinguish them, right? And one thing we can see here is how important this on-off ratio, this TMR, is. If we had a 50% TMR like our original devices, then we have very little room to encode these weights. But if we can go up to, say, 300% TMR, then we can have a lot of room to encode the weights. And in terms of how many weights we could expect to get out of this type of synapse, we can do a back-of-the-envelope calculation if you just look at the number of positions that the domain wall can have along a junction will be a function of both the domain wall effective size and the length of the junction. So in a perpendicularly magnetized material, this length of the domain wall is around 1/4 of the width. And so if the length is around a micron, I can say that the width of our junction is going to be 150 nanometers. And so 150, we expect around 17 weights. So it's not a huge number of weights, but it's not just a few either. So I think there's room to do a lot with around 10 to 15 weights. Maybe you could realistically get 10 or something. So this has been an exploding field for a while. There's a lot of work going on using these as synapses. And so we can predict that it can store weights. But so what we're asked is like, well, can we do more than just store weights? Can we implement some higher biological functionality? And so what we wanted to implement was called spike-time independent plasticity. So let me just give you a brief overview of what this is. And this is the idea that cells that fire together wire together. And these are some results from biology showing this behavior is how things gain their weight connection in biology. So, and this is from an actual synapse. Oh, I think my thing is dying. Well, so you can see on the left there, oh, here I come back. So on left here, we can see that we have this timing. Again, I said the synapse is connecting between a pre-synapse neuron and a post-synapse neuron. And it's really the timing of when those signals arrive at the synapse will determine how much strengthening or weakening that synapse has. So over here, this is in time, the post signal arrived before the pre-signal, and the weight change actually went negative, actually got weaker. And if instead the pre-signal arrives before the post-signal, then we strengthen. So when we weaken, it's called long-term depression, and when you strengthen, it's called long-term potentiation. And not only it's about which one arrives first, and it's also about how closely they arrive together. So if they arrive very close together, then we get strong potentiation. If they arrive but with more delay between them, we get weaker potentiation. And so this is what we want to capture in our magnetic devices. So what the domain wall does react to is the direction of the current. Current one will push the domain wall one way, current the other way will push it the other way. So what we wanted to do was convert the current direction into input-output pulses that could control this current direction. So to do this, we built a small circuit, and we try to keep it as low area as possible around each synapse. So in this picture, what it would look like is that we have our synapse in the center, and we're going to do our learning, our weight changes, using both this in-terminal and this clock terminal. So the presynaptic neuron will send a pulse on the inside, and the postsynaptic will send a pulse back at the clock side. And then depending on the timing, we want to be able to adjust where this domain wall is sitting. And then we'll show spike timing behavior. And so the circuit we built looks like this, where we have two RC resistors and capacitors on either side of our 3-terminal and N-terminal junction free layer to enable this type of behavior. So we implemented this circuit into a SPICE model using HSPICE. So we're using 1 nanosecond pulse widths and 10 nanosecond periods, and we have some, the resistance of the synapse is assumed to be 100 ohms. We have these resistors that are in the circuit and the capacitance. And so we can see here the transient output behavior. So here is for the presynaptic signal firing before the post. So the blue signal coming from the left neuron is before the orange right neuron with a 0.5 nanosecond delay between the two. And we can see in this case, when we see these fire, we get this positive going current pulse. It can switch, say, the current in this direction. If we have a 1 nanosecond delay, we still get these positive chains, and we can also switch in that direction. If we have instead the postsynaptic neuron firing first, now the orange is leading the blue, then we get current that's opposite direction, so we can push the rainbow back the other way, and we can see this with the 1 nanosecond delay as well. So if we have yes?
So the controls are squares, and the outputs are sort of these, like,
yeah, so we're controlling with this voltage. We are working on that now, actually, putting an array of them together.
Is it a problem for cascading, the fact that the shape changes, and can you use the similar shapes as input?
We are finding that it's not so bad, but you have to tune those resistors and capacitors correctly to make it work. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so this work is all just on one synapse. Yeah. Yeah, so if we have lack of correlation between our two neurons, then interestingly, we get this oscillatory behavior between up and down, which will kind of, if we're at a certain domain wall position, it'll move it back and forth around its position. So if we plot the current amplitude versus delay for the potentiation is when the pre leaves the post and this is when post leaves the pre, we see a very similar behavior to that which is seen in biology, showing this spike time independent plasticity behavior, where not only does one cause potentiation depression, but we also can, depending on the delay time, if there's very narrow delay, we get high current, high potentiation, or high depression. So we did look at, well, how perfect does our circuit have to be to have this type of behavior? So here we plot the current through the synapse as a function of the resistance of the synapse. And so that's the resistance of my ferromagnetic wire. And so the current does go down as we increase the resistance, but there's a pretty good regime, and it's really about tuning the device. Depending on what device current we need to switch that domain wall will depend where we want to sit on this curve. Yes, question? It's actually not. So yeah, that can be confusing. It's here. It's this current going back and forth across the bottom here. That's actually switching the domain wall. Yeah, so in this model, we're really just considering the resistance of this wire.
So where's the pre and post coming in?
Yeah, if I go back, it's OK. The pre and post are coming like this. So the pre is coming here, and the post is coming here to this side.
So what's going into the top?
In this simulation, we didn't consider the output resistance. So this is just like learning. And once it's learned, then it'll have a certain resistance state where you can measure through the out. Yeah. OK. So we can also look at the current through the synapse as a function of if there's a difference between the two capacitors. We see it has some variation, but it also is tolerable. We looked at the timing of the current pulse based on the variation of the capacitors, and this is actually a very narrow y-axis, so just pretty robust. So there is some tuning that would have to be required for the device requirements, but it seems approachable. OK, so in that simulation, we just assumed that the wire had a certain resistance, and everything was really about simulating the circuit in SPICE. But we wanted to be able to have a better understanding of, well, how is this domain wall going to be affected? So we recently developed, in this paper here, developed a SPICE-only model that is benchmarked against micromagnetic simulations to accurately represent what goes on in the magnetics in terms of the domain wall switching with current. And so using this SPICE model, then we can replace that which was just a wire with our SPICE model and get a SPICE-only model that includes the domain wall dynamics. And so we did that here. And so here you can see that we put into the SPICE circuit just a random train of pulses coming from the pre and post neurons. So the orange is the post and the blue is the pre, so sometimes one leads the other and there's various delays between them. And then this is the output of our model for what this is doing to the domain wall position. So we can see that when the post leaves the pre, the domain wall will move up, and then when the pre leaves the post, it'll move down. And depending on the delay, it'll move a different distance. And so we can see that we can predict that it can properly move this domain wall back and forth. We do see that it doesn't always do things perfectly the same, like here and here. It kind of had a more wiggly behavior. So there are some imperfections in how it's going to respond, which we would expect. Here, using the same model, we increase the different delays between the pre and post signals. And we can see that if we just apply those as a sequence of pulses to our device, that if we have a 5 nanosecond delay, the domain will only get so far. But if we have a 1 nanosecond delay, that should have more potentiation, and we can have a greater drastic change in the domain wall position, therefore a greater change in our weights. So we can see that this long-term potentiation can be implemented, including the domain wall dynamics. OK, so that's my conclusion of that section. So if you have any more questions on it, I'll also move on to talking about the neurons. OK, and you're welcome to ask more questions later. So, yes, question. Yeah.
So when you wire this thing, there's another layer on top to do the input.
Yeah.
It's like a layers probably. But I mean, the picture that you showed being one composite layer, and that'll give you another one on top.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I haven't done a detailed area. I'm not like a circuit layout expert, so I haven't done a detailed layout of how much these extra resistors and capacitors would add. But I imagine they would be in a layer above.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So hopefully they wouldn't affect the density too much, but there will be an effect on
Oh, but
density.
it's all doable. You're not just trying to get.
Yeah. But I mean, like, honestly, a lot of times that's left out of a lot of the work in this field. Like, even with when people, so the most mature aspect of using non-CMOS for neuromorphic computing is with resistive random access memory. And in that field, they often still have a transistor for every synapse, or if they can have a selector that works. Yeah, so there's often hidden extra circuitry that's not really shown. Yeah, so that's affecting the density. Yeah, but ideally you would like to have it really dense with nothing in between. Yeah, so this would probably be for applications where you really want that spike timing behavior. Yeah, and I'll show at the end why maybe that spike timing could be useful. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about how very similar devices can also act as neurons. Let's go into that. So the second device is very similar. What we do here is that we take this junction and we offset it to one side of the device. So now there's this time component to the domain wall movement, where if we have, again, we have an input current going from here to this clock to ground, then there's some delay in time that it takes for the domain wall to reach. And once it passes this junction, then the output current here will change, and that can be our firing. So we have, this will be called what's called integrating, and that will be called firing. And I'll talk about these other parts to it too. So what do we want to capture? So one thing to understand about neurons is that there's a number of models for how neurons operate, and how they operate in the brain actually depends on how they're behaving for a certain task. So here we're trying to represent one particular type of model of neuron called a leaky, integrate, and fire neuron. And so this is the type of behavior you want to capture. So this is over time. So if we have some current input into a neuron, then we want this integrating stage here where it hasn't fired yet, but there's some building towards firing. And then if it reaches some threshold, then it fires. Once it fires, it should reset. So we have this integrating, firing, reset, integrating, firing. If we pulse the current so it doesn't give it enough time to fire, then it's integrating, but it didn't fire. When we take away the current, we want the neuron to be able to relax back. This is called leaking, relax back to its original state. So if it's not getting fired a lot, it should relax. So that's the leaking component. So here it's integrating, leaking, until here it fires and it resets. So that's the behavior you want to capture in our artificial neurons. And in addition, we want to capture a behavior called winner takes all. I think I have a slide on this. Yeah. Well, in addition, we want to capture this behavior called winner takes all, or lateral inhibition. And this is another thing that happens in the brain, where if one neuron is winning out, if it's getting ahead and getting closer to firing, it can suppress the behavior of the nearby neuron so that they don't fire. So therefore, it's the only one that wins and fires. And both this leaking and this winner take all firing is important for learning. And it is captured today in CMOS-based machine learning circuit designs, but it's usually implemented through a lot of extra transistors, which makes it both bulky and power hungry. So here's an example of a machine learning circuit, and you can see here in blue here is the circuitry to perform the leaking operation. So you can see how many transistors it takes to do this type of leaking. For this winner take all, here's an example from a patent where they were describing a winner-take-all circuit. In this paper, it requires about 5 transistors per neuron to implement this winner-take-all or lateral inhibition behavior. But this really blows up as you have a lot of neurons. So if you had 2,000 neurons, it would require 1,000 additional transistors. But we can see that if we can perform these type of operations, it could have a lot of benefit for the computing ability. So in this paper, they showed that when they implemented this winner-take-all strategy with all these extra transistors, they were able to have the computing power of 2 layers of a neural network only using 1. So they can double their computing power by having this ability. And it's really about, if you can get one neuron to fire and suppress ones that didn't fire, you're reducing the amount of neurons that are getting activated, so you don't have as many neurons that you're having to train or read. So it really helps solve the equation quicker. So really what we can see here is that if we can capture this types of behavior inherent in the devices, we could both drastically reduce circuitry and also increase energy efficiency. So that's what we want to do in our magnetic devices. And so how we accomplish this is through, like I said, this domain wall motion is going to be our integration. If it passes this junction, that's our firing. And then at first we implemented the leaking by having an external magnetic field, which could either be external or could be integrated into the device as an extra magnetic layer. And this field doesn't have to be very large. Here is 20 millitesla. And this provides the leaking. So when we turn off, there's a competition between the current want to drive the domain wall one way and the field driving it back the other way. And so we simulated this in magnetic simulations, shown here. So this is domain wall position versus time. And this is compared to, in orange, these are our current pulses that we're applying to the device. So when we apply the current, we get integration. So the domain wall starts moving to the other side. And then when we take away the current in this region, the domain wall in the field oscillates in the field and slowly drifts back the other way. So we're getting our integration and leaking like this. We showed in some follow-up papers that this leaking could also be done using either an anisotropy gradient or also a shape anisotropy gradient, so you don't have to use an external field. Yes? Yeah, so in this regime, there's two things going on. The domain wall has we're actually going to get into this a little bit later because this angle is actually important. The domain wall has an angle to its own magnetic moments. And so in the field, it can change with the field. But also in this simulation, we were operating the devices actually slightly above what's called Walker breakdown. So the domain wall angle was less stable. So it was oscillating more in the field. Yeah. But we're actually going to get into that more. Yeah. Okay, so here's a movie just so you can see. This is the wire, and black and white are the down and up domains simulated in micromagnetics. So just looking in time, so this is the domain wall moving back and forth and also oscillating in its magnetic moment back to the other side until it hits the next integration point, and then the current will push it farther. So then it's integrating forward and then starting to leak back. So you can see this in the simulation. And so I'm going to go back to this later, but just to show you how we're implementing lateral inhibition, we can really get this through these magnetic stray field interactions, which is kind of exciting because magnetic stray field interactions are usually a detriment for things like trying to do memory with these magnetic thin films, but we can actually make it a useful part of our devices for the neurons. So if this center domain wall is winning out, then the stray field can suppress the motion of these nearby neurons. So this is how we imagine it being in an array where you have these different neurons with the domain walls integrating along them. Okay, so we wanted to see if with these neurons we could, in micromagnetic modeling, so really including all the magnetism, do a digit image recognition task. So usually the task everyone tries to do is there's this set of data called the MNIST data set, which is a bunch of handwritten digits, and we want to be able to identify them. So for this simulation, we only focused on the output neurons. So the input neurons were coming from our collaborator who had an RAM, a resistive random access memory simulation. So these are made with a different type of device simulated. And in pre-trained, it was kind of given to us. And then what we did is we took the outputs of those and scaled the current signals to what we need to move the domain wall. And then we input those into our micromagnetic simulation of 10 neurons side by side. So that's what we simulated here. And so these are our 10 neurons, 0 to 9, side by side. And so here we can see the domain wall position over time as we input the different image of digits. So these are the different images of different digits that we input into the input side of our circuit. And what we want to see is that here we're having each neuron represent a digit. And so we want that neuron to fire when that digit is introduced to our circuit. And so that's what we can see here. So you can see over time here, number 1 was introduced. And so this green neuron, number 1, is the one that fired. But you can see that this other neuron that almost fired at the same time, that number 8 almost fired. So you can see there's some imperfections. Here's 3. So the 3 fired, and neuron 1 was just behind it. So here's 8, and 8 fired. Just to show you what it looks like in a movie. So when 3 is here, we can see 3 gets ahead and fires. And so this is all including all the micromagnetics. So it is including the magnetic stray field interactions between each of these neurons and how the randomized input currents are affecting the brain walls. So this is before an image is introduced. We just have these random input currents hitting the devices. And then when 7 is introduced, neuron 7 is fires. So yes? Yeah, so it was pre-trained. The array was pre-trained. So it was really just, this is really just showing that our output layer can respond to the trained signals. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and the time domain for this like current leaking thing is much longer than the nanoseconds you were quoting before, right? This is microseconds?
Yeah, if you go back to this, this is microseconds, so it just depends on how much field you're using to leak, but it depends on and also how long these wires are. So we made these wires pretty long. I think they're like a few microns long. So you could really scale it down. Yeah, nanoseconds is like the regime as which magnetization switches, but then you have to translate along the wire and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is the total transient domain wall position for this time for as we just input a bunch of different digits into this simulation. And so we can look at the digit we know we inputted versus what we got out. And we can see that we get some errors. So this gave us 94% accuracy when we ran it 100 times. So it's kind of like just like a first try at seeing how we can actually use these as neurons. But including all the magnetism, because we're really doing this with the micromagnetic simulations, which are well-benchmarked simulations.
What's the right relationship?
I have an equation that maybe will help you a little bit. I'm not sure.
Poorly? Like, do I want the arrow pointing along the correct direction or not along the correct direction?
It depends what you're trying to do. So here what we're trying to do is inhibit the motion of one neuron based on the other. So in that way, you'd want the angle of the domain wall such that the current doesn't push on it very well.
Okay,
So yeah. It doesn't have to be perpendicular. No, it's not exactly perpendicular. It really has to do with the physics of the Landau-Lissach-Gilder equation and how the torques are affecting. So when you apply current to the wire, there's a certain torque on the magnetic moments, and that torque has an angle to it. So it's how the domain wall angle compares to that torque angle. Yeah. Yeah. So you can see that here. So if this is the propagation direction x, y is in this direction. So z is the out of plane direction. So we're totally talking about this angle that the domain wall moments, these moments, are sitting out of plane. And so we can look at this with this kind of plot where these are the different angles that the domain wall can have. So this black line is when the wires are very close together and we're above Walker breakdown. So here the domain wall is continually processing along these different angles as it moves. So this is above Walker breakdown, the velocity versus time. And you can see this how it depends on phi, the angle here. And here phi is changing in time. These other things are like the saturation magnetization, the anisotropy, and the anisotropy field, things like that, damping, all those things. So below Walker breakdown, we're in a steady regime where the velocity is dependent on whatever angle it's sitting at. And so we can see that here. So these are different spacings between our two neurons. We can get the domain wall to sit at this particular angle. So maybe that makes that figure clear. And so what we can see then is that by tuning both the spacing, but then also, for example, the saturation magnetization or the width of the wire, we can even send the second domain wall in a negative direction. So we can really suppress its motion and even send it back the other way. So we can see here that we can get, for example, if we had our saturation field of 1.6 Tesla, we can get like almost negative domain wall velocity for velocity 2, and same for a certain wire width for a given spacing. So we can really tune this behavior a lot more than we originally thought, and the physics is a little richer than we really thought was just stray field interactions. Okay, so in my last 10 minutes, let me discuss an example of what we can do with these magnetic neurons and synapses and how capturing this biological behavior more inherently can enable some new methods for computation. And this is led by my collaborator at Sandia, who is a machine learning expert. So I will try to explain, but I'm not a machine learning expert. I'm trying to learn, though. OK, so we took these results and we applied them to a model of doing some actual learning. And in this example, we did semi-supervised learning, and we're able to show that we can do this with vastly reduced peripheral circuitry by having this inherent lateral inhibition, winner-take-all, and spike time independent plasticity of our synapses. So just to introduce you to these types of learning, the brain is largely unsupervised learning. That means that the rules for how the neurons should fire in the brain are not preset. We don't know how to train it what it should do. And so it's able to through self-reinforcement, learn a certain task. And so that's a really important area of research. It's not totally well understood how it does yet, but we know it's very energy efficient. Versus most machine learning today is implemented, which is implemented in CMOS, is fully supervised, where in this case we have a set of learning rules. We know what task we want our computer to learn. So we want to learn to recognize dogs, and we can tell it when it did it right or wrong and then correct it. So that's fully supervised learning. And so we understand how to do this, but there is a high energy cost doing this. So we're having to train everything and correct everything all the time, so it's more power hungry. So another thing about supervised learning is that it's usually implemented by constantly modifying the weights of our synapses based on whether they did something right or wrong. And so this is done using something called back-propagation. So in this picture, these are our different neurons, and they're connected by some weights from the synapses, as we have different layers of our neural network. And so these are inputs for some previous layer. They go through some resistive crossbar array. It could be made out of anything, RAM, MRAM, or CMOS. And then if there's some error that is not meeting the task, it didn't fire as we think it should, then there's some comparator circuit, and then that error is backpropagated to adjust those weights. So it's this constant adjustment of the weights based on how they compare to what when we're trying to teach them, or when they're trying to have them learn, compared to what we know the output should be. What makes us power hungry is that we're applying it to every synapse. So every synapse is constantly getting these weight adjustments. And also, it makes it difficult to implement real-time learning tasks where we might not have a perfectly well-defined training set. We might not know how to perfectly tell it, or you fired right or wrong. So what we implemented here was trying to do something in between, so using what's called semi-supervised learning. And in particular, we tried to capture spike timing behavior, leaking, and winner-take-all behavior inherently in our devices, and seeing what this can gain us. So to do this, we made a toy model of the synapse and neuron devices that could be implemented to MATLAB. So it really just captured the behavior in some numericals. So this doesn't have the micromagnetics at all. And then we implemented the following circuit shown here. So first we have our input neurons, and once again we're going to input this MNIST data set of images of numbers. We're going to input, there's more than just 10 of these. There's like 800 of these. We input them into a synapse array made out of our magnetic devices and our toy model of them. And then we're going to output them to this output neuron layer, which is then going to be input into our second supervised layer. So this layer will perform some task, so it will correct itself, but this layer won't. And so just looking at layer by layer, so starting with the unsupervised layer. So first we start with the random weights of the synapses. So they're just randomly weighted. And then we have our MNIST image. It's made out of 784 pixels. So we take that matrix and we make it into a vector array. And every pixel, which is either a 0 or a voltage to represent black and white, we input into each of these neurons. So each neuron gets an information about each pixel. So then we send these images through. And then for every image, what we do in the unsupervised layer is that out here, if the neuron spikes, then we send a signal back in to strengthen the synapses when it spiked. So using spike time independent plasticity or long-term potentiation, we're strengthening that synapse. And if it doesn't spike, then we send a signal back to weaken that synapse connection, so long-term depression. So we're not telling whether it's right or wrong. We're just strengthening things that spike and weakening things that don't spike. That's all we're doing in this layer. Yes?
So it's like positive feedback, you want it to blow up.
Yeah, exactly. So basically what we're doing here is just saying that for these numbers, there's some, well, I'll show this in a second, there's some characteristic behavior inherent to the whole set where some of them are spiking a lot and some aren't. So let's tell it, okay, it's good if you're spiking a lot, and it's not, and if you're not spiking, don't spike. Yeah, so that's what we do here. So yeah, so what we're really doing is, in this unsupervised layer, we're able to filter down the set of pixels that are important for recognizing these images. And so what we get out of this layer, so we input all these different images, is we get these signatures for each image in the MNIST data set. So they're not the actual images, but they're like some signature that defines for us which neurons are most important for recognizing that image. So this is what the signatures look at. And we simulated this both for analog spike timing dependent plasticity, where we can have this analog behavior like what I showed in the 3-terminal tunnel junctions, or if we just had binary, so we just had ability to have like 2 resistance states. And so you can get these signature images in this layer. So one thing we see is that using spike time-independent plasticity in our synapses, we can learn much quicker than if we had a random weight distribution without spike timing. So we can see that for the spike timing, we can get to these like images like this, and it approaches these images pretty quickly in the number of data that we send into it. And this is an example of what the, this characteristic image looks like for just random weights. Okay, so then once we have that layer done, then we moved on to the supervised layer. And so for the supervised layer, we're going to input a few of the MNIST known images, and now we know what they are, through our unsupervised layer out to our supervised layer. And then we compare each output signal to some teacher signal. Now we know what the image should be, so we tell it whether it's right or wrong. So if this correct signal, we leave it as it is. If it's incorrect signal, we send it back a pulse to either strengthen or weaken the synapses in this layer. So we're just using the first layer to reduce the amount of neurons that fire, so that in the second layer, we only have to correct less neurons, versus use the traditional approach, you will be correcting everything. So that's where we get a lot of power savings. So, so the results from this is that if we look at the ability to predict these image data sets, we can first see that if we use a random method, so in the random method, the unsupervised layer, we just set the weights randomly. We don't have this feedback. So this is what a random output from the first unsupervised layer looks like. And we get 78%. So you get 78% accuracy at recognizing images, even if you just have a random layer. So it's like, can we do better? And that's kind of like the baseline. So with STDP, that's when we had these binary magnetic tonal junctions modeled as our synapses. And so the unsupervised output looks something like this, and we get around 88% accuracy. If we move to our analog spike timing behavior, like with the 3T-MTJs I modeled, this is what the output for the unsupervised look like, and we can get to 92% accuracy in the simulation. And so to compare this to a CMOS neural network, so a perceptron, which is a 1-layer neural network with fully supervised learning, gains around 84%. But as we said, the fully supervised is very area and power hungry. Or you can use a multi-layer perceptron, which is fully supervised learning, and you have many of these neural layers. And that can get up to 95 to 98%, so very high accuracy. But again, you're sacrificing area and power. So what really showed here is we can have this more energy efficient, compact way to do this by having some of this behavior be inherent to the devices. And I hope you've shown you that having this behavior inherent to the devices can really enable these this learning to happen in more real time. Yeah. So really using these properties as STDP, leaking, and lateral inhibition can get to 92% accuracy. Okay, so to conclude my talk, I've discussed how magnetic devices could address bottlenecks in computing, and I've gone into the spike time-independent plasticity behavior of these 3 terminal magnetic tunnel junction synapses, and how we can also make leaky, integrated, and fired neurons with these 3T-MTJ structures. And then I've shown you an application for semi-supervised learning. So let me just end by acknowledging my collaborators. So the students in my group who worked on this project is Leaky. He did a lot of the simulations of the synapse. San is doing all the work on the lateral inhibition. Thomas is making the devices, and Mashid is doing a lot of electrical testing of the devices. Dr. Friedman at UT Dallas is a collaborator on the circuit side of things, so he especially worked on developing the circuits for the neurons. And Dr. Bennett, I mentioned before, is machine learning at Sandia, and he led the work on the machine learning that shows the end. And Dr. Marinella is also at Sandia, who is kind of leading our collaboration there. Okay, so I'll end there, and please ask me more questions.